FDA's new leadership is rowing the agency into calmer waters as it seeks a permanent commissioner and permanent center directors. We'll check in with Washington editor Steve Usdin on the latest as FDA enters a new phase. Also on the BioCentury This Week podcast, FDA's real-time clinical trials initiative may have real but unexpected benefits. Meanwhile, in deal land, Servier continues its M&A build-out. It's acquiring Edgewise's Neuro programs as it seeks to add a new pillar to its pipeline. That was one of several billion-dollar-plus deals in biopharma over the past few days. We'll have a look at the latest in biopharma deal-making and check in with the 900-pound gorilla in biotech deals, Eli Lilly. I'm Jeff Cranmer, executive editor at BioCentury and host of the BioCentury This Week podcast. Joining me, our editor-in-chief, Simone Fishburne, our man in the UK, Stephen Hansen, and of course, Steve Usdin. Welcome to the show, guys. Gonna start off with Simone, back from Seattle. Simone, how was your time up in the PNW?
So actually, Jeff, would you like to hear my new theory about Seattle, which I got about? I told about 10 people this, and they all agreed with me. So Seattle really wants to be part of Canada. It doesn't really want to be part of the US. I'm just saying, because everybody in Seattle doesn't really live there. They live in these little islands around, and they all take little boats or planes to get into Seattle. I don't think they like Americans so much. I think they like Canadians. And they're all kind of like Canadian, nice and chill. I'm just saying that. Great place, but
Soggy.
Also, yeah, I also want to say that your Cascadia idea got a lot of momentum there. You know?
It's true. I continue to be a proponent of Cascadia, bringing together Alaska, British Columbia, Washington State, Oregon, California, and we'll even throw on Baja because, you know, who doesn't like those beaches down near Cabo?
It's a lot of coast.
I like it.
Right. So when the AI bots take over or some other then. But yeah, no, I mean, Grand Rounds was a huge success, and now we're very excited about Amsterdam in the fall. But, you know, we have a podcast coming out later this week. There were a few highlight sessions. You know, for me, I get the pleasure of a fireside chat with Chris Arendt, who's the CSO of Takeda, really talking about how that company is imbuing it, like really working with AI throughout. And that was a very interesting take he had. And another panel is a topic we're going to talk a lot about, which is first in human trials. And one of the issues comes up between, if you want to expedite them, how much the universities themselves can do, like improving the IRB process and reducing a certain amount of back and forth, a lot of issues around protocol amendments. And there's a certain amount that requires sort of FDA or regulatory change. One of the interesting things is, you know, there's all this talk about AI, and it feels like there has been for a long while, but actually the AI conversation is changing massively and so fast, even within 6 months. I mean, if we all think where we were 6 months ago, I don't think we were all using Claude and really integrating it in our daily work. And so the AI fluency is just growing up so fast, and staying ahead of that is pretty interesting.
Just don't tell Ronnie Chang. He gave his fabulous Harvard commencement address and called upon Harvard's recent graduates to destroy AI.
They may need to go to Claude and ask how to do that.
Excellent. And we also had the Rising Star winner at Grand Rounds, Sylvain Simon, out of Fred Hutch, with a synthetic chimeric T-cell receptor. You can read about that. Our brilliant colleague, Dr. Danielle Golovin, wrote about it. It's in front of the paywall. I'll drop a link into the show notes so you can read about this new tech out of Fred Hutch. All right, Steve, another busy week for you in Washington. Quite a few interesting meetings went down, including one with the new FDA commissioner doing his first official meeting, and it was with the rare disease community. What went down?
acting FDA commissioner.
Oh, I shouldn't get ahead of myself.
Yeah, yeah. And that's interesting. Actually, there's some momentum. Some people are saying, well, why not make him the commissioner? I don't think that he will. I don't think that that's going to happen for a variety of reasons. Look, there's a sense at FDA that with McCarry's exit, kind of a fever is broken, right? It started that with the Doge destruction, and it kind of peaked with a memo that Vinay Prasad sent to staff outlining his intention to substitute ideology for science and the regulation of vaccines and other products, along with the resignation of Rick Pazder as senior director, and appointment of Tracy Beth Hoag to succeed him on an acting basis. So now it feels like all of that's kind of a long time ago, even though it really wasn't. And acting FDA Commissioner Kyle Diamantis is really trying to row the agency back into calmer waters. And one of his most public steps was this June 3 meeting with rare disease patient advocates. It was a closed door meeting, but there were representatives from 15 groups there. They all came out of it talking to me and other reporters. The acting CEDAR director was there. The acting CBER director was there. Other agency leaders were there. The discussion was facilitated by Amy Rick, who's head of the Rare Disease Hub. And the people who I spoke with who attended the meeting came away with the sense that FDA really wants, one, to mend its relationship with the rare disease community, and two, to rebuild trust. A big part of that is going to be going back to more regular ways of doing things, which is really based on supporting the work of career scientists and abandoning the top-down approach that McCarry and Prasad applied to FDA. The thing about that is that, FDA wasn't perfect before the Doge, and McCarry started whacking it with a 2x4. And so much leadership, so much institutional memory and talent has walked out the door. It isn't going to be possible to revert to where it was in 2024. So part of the agency's leadership job now is sorting through the initiatives that McCarry announced or started, many of which were well-intentioned, and figuring out how to implement them in ways that advance the agency's mission without causing inadvertent harm.
Steve, so, there's two parts of this, and, you're right. There's no going back. There's no point in trying to reinstate the FDA that was before McCarry's time. So I guess it's, one thing is redesigning it going forward. You, of course, wrote most of Back to School last year that actually addressed what it should look like. But there are some things that need to be done, and it looks like some things are being undone. So you had a piece on CRLs, right, that had sort of thrown a lot of companies, or a few companies, into disarray. And are they getting back into array, shall we say? Can you talk a little bit about the CRLs?
Yeah, so basically what I did is I looked at some of the unexpected setbacks that have happened. Most of them have been CRLs. There have also been some that have been at earlier stages, but the CRLs are the most obvious ones. So I looked at them, and I looked and see which ones of those have been rowed back or seem to be getting back on track, right? And I identified 7 CRLs that were issued under McCarry that have either been reversed, or the companies have had meetings with FDA and have come out of them saying that they think that they're going to be back on track. That's pretty interesting. And then there's another about 7 of them that are pending, that it's unclear exactly what's going to happen with them, but I think that they're probably also being reevaluated. I know that all of the companies are engaged in discussions with FDA, and I wouldn't be surprised to see some of those rolled back as well.
Steve, I just thinking about this now. I mean, we've seen numerous instances, right, in the past, say, 18 months or 16 months or however long it's been that McCarry's been there, where companies were talking about how, they had gotten advice from FDA or had discussions with FDA about trial design, about a product, and sort of a way forward for a program that then changed drastically on them at the time. And it was, all this upset and issues came from that. Should companies now be thinking that if they had gotten advice, say in 2024, or sort of pre-McCarry advice, can you rely on that advice now again, do you think? Is that something they can feel confident moving forward in? Or is there still concern there?
No, there's still got to be concern. And I think that the fact that some of the things some of the CRLs are being reconsidered is definitely good for the patients who are depending on those products. Of course, not all of them. It's not necessarily the case that all of them were inappropriate, but for those that were inappropriate, for those that were big diversions from FDA's path that it had been on, I think that the companies concerned, and certainly the patients who are going to hope to benefit from those products, feel like things are getting on a better path. It's not as clear what's happening with things that have less visibility, things that are earlier in the pipeline. And I think that that's where the problems stemming from FDA's losing a lot of institutional memory, from losing a lot of its leadership, from losing even the connective tissue that it needs to be able to evaluate submissions, that's going to be an ongoing overhang. It's going to be an ongoing problem. I think that we'll have a lot better idea, everyone will, when we know who's the next FDA commissioner, and especially when we know what's happening with the center directors. There's a possibility that the acting center directors who are in place now, either one of them will be asked to stay on in a permanent capacity, or it's also possible that there'll be new center directors appointed. The logical way to do that would be to do it after a commissioner has been nominated and confirmed, so that they'll play a part in selecting the new center directors. But that isn't necessarily the way it's going to happen. But in any case, I think we'll have a better answer to the question after we know who the next commissioner is, after we know who the next center directors are, and kind of what the Trump administration's posture to FDA is going to be for the remainder of the administration.
All right, Steve. Well, let's head over to the Real-Time Clinical Trials Initiative. Now, here's something that came up in the McCary regime, and it's sticking around. They're not getting rid of this one. It's making some big promises. You wrote that the initiative is looking to sweep away 60 years of tradition. What exactly did you mean by that?
Well, no, what I said is, what I meant to say, I think is what I said, is that when then Commissioner McCary announced it, he announced it like he did with a lot of things, with these sweeping claims and assertions, and saying that he was doing away with 60 years of tradition and everything was starting over new again. I don't think that that's really what's going to happen. And what is interesting about it is that I think that the parts that what I wrote, I called it the unglamorous data plumbing. That part of the initiative probably is going to be the clearest win from it, right? So it's essentially a multivariate experiment. One variable involves process improvements, and the other one changes the relationship between regulators and sponsors by turning trials into continuously supervised events. So the first part, the process improvements, which at least in the pilot stage lean heavily on work from Paradigm Health to automate clinical trials data, are unambiguously beneficial. And I think that they're beneficial for two reasons. One reason is that Paradigm's got systems for extracting data from routine clinical care and using it to create data for clinical trials that obviates the need for a tremendous amount of manual data input now. And the people who I spoke with said you really can't exaggerate how much benefit that's going to be. It's going to save tremendous amounts of time. It's going to improve quality. But the other thing that's really interesting about this to me is, and the main thing I think, is that for this real-time initiative, what FDA did was they said, well, instead of having companies submit massive amounts of data, raw data to FDA, which in some cases amounts to millions of pages by the time an NDA or BLA is submitted, they're going to submit signals. And in order to determine what those signals are, the companies, the sponsors, and FDA, they're going to meet in advance, and they're going to define what would be actionable data, what would be actionable safety data, what would be actionable efficacy data from trials. And then they're going to report that in something like real time. And then FDA reviewers, if they want, will be able to ask for additional information. Well, the step of doing that is really critical. It could be transformative because you're saying in advance, here are the things that matter. And by the way, when you're saying that, you're also saying everything else, unless there's something, completely earth-shaking that you hadn't anticipated, everything else probably doesn't matter. So you're making it possible to separate the signal from the noise at an early stage, and that's going to have downstream effects for the whole review. And I think that may be the most important aspect of this whole thing that's been underappreciated.
So, Steve, from a bean counter point of view, how are we going to not necessarily measure that impact? Because as a bean counter, I don't necessarily need to measure it precisely, but how's it going to be evident? Will it be just faster reviews? What is the way that companies are going to start kind of palpably feeling this?
For one thing, it's important to note that the two proof of concept trials from AbbVie and Amgen that are using this process are very small early stage trials. FDA is planning to expand it into a pilot phase with more companies conducting more trials, but they're also initially going to be early stage trials. So the kinds of things, when you say to speed up decision making, the kinds of decisions that are going to be accelerated, it's not going to be the final approvals at this point. What's going to be accelerated are going to be things like dose escalation decisions or no-go decisions on going from a phase 2A to a phase 2B, for example. I think personally, and this is kind of what I was trying to get at in my story, I think that the time savings there are not as important as the benefits to kind of clarity of thinking around changing from a mindset where companies are submitting massive amounts of raw data to one where they're identifying actionable signals and then communicating back and forth with FDA about those actionable signals. I think that's what's going to be really important. So I think that the quality is going to be more important than the quantity than the speed.
I'm going to argue on behalf of the companies that's really important time saving. Like if you are getting that better information sooner and more reliably and so on, I think that's very palpably relevant to companies. I understand it's, not necessarily, I think there are a lot of parts. This is like also the first in human conversation that we keep having. There's a lot of parts along the continuum that aren't just around how fast did I get my approval after I got all the data there, right? And I think breaking down these bits, so I think that's really interesting.
Well, and part of it, though, it remains to be seen whether it really will speed those decisions. But I think that the process improvements along the way are going to have been worth it, even if it doesn't speed those decisions. So that's really the really important thing here to take a look at. And I think it's a good example of what we're going to see, getting back to the earlier conversation about what Acting Commissioner Kyle Diamantis is trying to do and what I think other FDA leaders are trying to do, which is trying to take these ideas that have come up over the last year and a half, these initiatives that were announced, which honestly, we've talked about this on the podcast in the past, many of them were half-baked and were really announced more for their PR value than for their practical effects. So now it's the time to kind of try to dig in and make these things work and make these things work in ways that benefit patients, that benefit the companies that are developing drugs and advance FDA's mission. And I think this real-time clinical trial project or pilot is an example of how FDA is going to have to dig into these things and kind of pull out the parts that are really going to benefit patients. And I think there's a similar reevaluation that's going on about what was formerly called the Commissioner's National Priority Voucher Program, which is the Commissioner's name has been stricken from it, but there's still an evaluation to see, well, what's really valuable there, if anything, and should it be retained? There's a similar discussion that's ongoing, an effort at FDA and in the rare disease community over the plausible mechanism framework and trying to figure out how to make that live up to the promise that advocates and FDA and biotech companies really hope to achieve with it.
All right. Thanks for that update, Steve. We're going to take a quick break and we're going to come back and talk deals.
This episode of BioCentury This Week is brought to you by the second BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe in Amsterdam, September 23rd to 25th. The second edition of BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe convenes the leaders shaping the future of biopharma. This time we meet in Amsterdam, September 23rd to 25th, gathering academic innovators, biotech CEOs, pharma R&D leaders and investors to debate the translational science that will define the next decade. Grand Rounds Europe focuses on what matters most: breakthrough biology, transformative technologies, and how to make early-stage R&D investable. Gram Rounds is where rigorous science meets real-world execution. Join BioCentury and regional host chairs Forbion and BGV and take a deep dive on translational opportunities in the Benelux region. BioCentury Gram Rounds Europe, where discovery moves toward impact. Register at biocenturygramrounds.com.
We are back on the BioCentury This Week podcast. I'm Jeff Cranmer, executive editor here at BioCentury, and we've got Stephen Hansen with us to talk about the latest in billion-dollar biotech deals. We had a lot to kick off the year, it felt like, and into spring, and felt a little light lately, but good to see Servier ramping back up. They're paying north of $1 billion to accelerate its build out in Neuro, and it's buying a key asset from Edgewise, actually well north of $1 billion, right, Stephen?
Right.
1.5 billion.
1.55.
All right, cool. Well, tell us about what they're getting and what they're trying to do.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jeff. Servier has the point I kind of want to make here is that they're kind of taking and repeating a playbook that they've sort of already used. So Servier, this French sort of what I guess you might describe as a mid-sized private pharma company, really wanted to get into cancer about 8 years ago. So first thing they did is they went to Shire and they bought Shire's oncology business, which gave them one marketed product and a few to add to their pipeline. That was 2018. They then did a similar thing in 2020. They bought Agios's cancer business for a couple $2 billion, which added some more products. And then most recently, earlier this year, they bought Day One Pharmaceuticals for even more, which gave them another marketed product. But that was the thing. In each case, they were adding both marketed products and some pipeline assets to add to that. And basically, they were able to go from having no presence in oncology and very little presence in the US to basically now having a pretty large commercial presence in the US. They've built out R&D there, along with this sort of big cancer pipeline that is now basically one of their biggest growth drivers. And so effectively, that's sort of like a second pillar for Servier on top of their more legacy cardiovascular programs. Now they're looking to neuro and hoping to do the same thing again, essentially. And so Edgewise is basically the first big deal in neurology for Servier to try and accelerate and build out a pipeline there. So what they're getting here, as you mentioned, they're getting a program called Sevasemten, which I'm going to shorten to Seva because I don't want to have to say Sevasemten lots of times because it'll mess me up. So they acquire Seva, which is in a pivotal phase 2 trial to treat Becker's muscular dystrophy. And the thing they see here is, if you're familiar with muscular dystrophies, obviously DMD, Duchenne muscular dystrophy is the big one that affects boys, pediatric age children. But then Becker's dystrophy is essentially a similar set of symptoms, but the onset is much later. It usually happens in the teens or early 20s, and it's slower progressing, but it can have the same outcome potentially as DMD. And the difference is that there's no treatments approved for Becker's muscular dystrophy. So they see an opening here to potentially come in with a sort of first in disease therapy for Becker's. The difference, though, between what Servier did previously and what they're doing now, though, is previously, as I mentioned, all of those deals came with a commercial asset. So there wasn't a lot of risk. There was some risk in the sense that, if some of the pipeline stuff didn't play out, then maybe you don't get as much as you'd hope for, but everything was already approved. Big difference here is this asset is in, as I said, in this pivotal study. It reads out at the end of the year. And if it doesn't work here, it's probably not going to work in the follow-up indication of DMD. And so it's a much more binary risk event for Servier. And so I found that quite interesting as well, is that they were sort of willing to up the risk factor in this first big attempt to build out their neuro pipeline.
What else do they have?
So they've got, this was their biggest deal in neuro. It wasn't the first one. They actually did a deal last year with Caris Bioscience Limited for, I think it was up to $450 million total. That brought them a program that's in phase 1 for Fragile X syndrome. They've also got an in-house sort of ASO oligo platform that they're using to generate some candidates. So they've got one that's in phase 1 development for developmental epileptic encephalopathies. And, in talking to David Lee, who's head of their US affiliate, that's kind of the area that they're thinking about. Movement disorders, encephalopathies, seizures. That's kind of the area that they, these rare neurological disorders is kind of where they're
So
looking
not
to build.
Alzheimer's or Parkinson's.
Nope,
just
not
something
Alzheimer's,
that-
not Parkinson's.
Okay.
Yeah, they're trying to avoid those big ones and try and stick to stuff where they think they can, they can move the needle.
Well, very active, but not quite as active as Eli Lilly, Stephen. You took a look at their pipeline. How many deals have they done so far this year?
Yeah, so they've done I looked at both partnerships and acquisitions. So they've done 20 deals overall so far this year, and looking at a total deal value basis, basically what they've committed to. Obviously, a lot of this is milestones and these sorts of commitments, but they've committed to 45 billion so far in their deal making up to this point. It's a big number, and it's been really active. And so here's the little trivia question I can ask related to Lilly's deals. So out of these 20 deals, Simone, Jeff, how many do you think were obesity related?
I did so bad on your last
Out of 20?
question.
Oh.
Out of 20.
I'm going to say
Is
I'm
that-
going to
I mean,
say not that many. I'm going to go with, you're going with 2, Jeff?
I'm going
You're going
to.
to say it out loud. You're going 2.
Well,
I'm
I'm
going with
be polite and let you
5.
go first.
Do you think 5, Simone?
You went. I'm going with 5, and he went with 2. He can't roll
Jeff
back
went
now.
with 2. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so the answer is, and this is overtly, obviously there are a couple ones where the targets aren't disclosed, but overtly, only one of those deals is an obesity deal. So I found that quite interesting.
Yeah, but covertly, I'm going. I'm leaning on the covert here.
I think the point is though that it's less than you would expect. That you would have expected at least a couple of those deals to have been obesity focused, which is obviously that's their current and near term sort of bread and butter, right? I mean, they pulled in 36 billion.
All right, I'm going to go back at you here, Stephen. Not trivia, right? But I've been talking to people. All right, I've been talking. Now, I will stipulate very clearly, this is not my view. I think Lilly should go and do whatever deals Lilly wants to do. Got a load of money and it can do whatever it wants. Okay. But some of its peer farmers are like, what's Lilly doing? What are they doing? What are they, a vaccine company now? So there's that, right? And do they even have the people who can, make these deals actually go somewhere? That's a thing. Although on the vaccine front, there's talk that this was a Peter Marks related foray for them. Like he's there, he can do that. But you can address that. But there's nothing wrong with a new kid on the block strutting their stuff. But I do think there's one thing that we're also hearing, which is, are Lilly's deals actually going to skew the market? Like, because they can pay and they are paying what they want. And are they actually enough of a factor now that they're going to start skewing it, which is a question. So
possibly. So here's what I think. I think Lilly is a very different buyer than most of the other farmers out there, in the sense that most other farmers are still looking to plug LOE holes coming up, right? They're still looking for later stage stuff. I mean, I know some of it's pushing a bit earlier, but I think by and large, what everyone wants still are the late stage assets to fill in. That's not what Lilly's doing. Lilly's late stage pipeline and, near launch commercial are covered. Like as I was saying, their tirzepatide franchise last year had 36.5 billion in sales, and the combined growth of those two products was like 118%. So I don't think they're hurting in the late stage asset. They're not in that same position. And so all of these deals were phase 2 or earlier. The majority of them were research or preclinical. So I think this is Lilly looking long term. How do we build out? How do we diversify our opportunity set for that early stage part of our pipeline? And so when you mention like the infectious, they're moving into other areas of neurology that they haven't really been in before. I think this is them sort of using these strong cash flows to be able to take risks and try and push the boat out on things that, maybe you wouldn't otherwise do if you had very near term issues. And so I think this is them actually being pretty smart in saying, hey, we have these opportunities. Let's try and maximize and see how much we can expand out and build out. Whereas, to be honest, I think some other farmers just aren't in a position necessarily to be able to take those risks because they have bigger problems that are much more near term, is the way I guess I would think of
The
it.
LOE, which for those scoring at home, loss of exclusivity, good old fashioned patent cliff. So, well, that's interesting, Stephen. I know that's in my inbox for editing. I look forward to checking that out. We woke up to a couple of other deals that were sizable today. J&J getting into the degrader antibody conjugate space, which got off to a bit of a rocky start, but is starting to gain a bit of momentum. I count roughly 8 deals since 2021. Our colleague Danielle did a nice little analysis of this space. So what we have here is J&J paying, let's see.
It's $1 billion up front, I think, in
Okay.
cash
Yeah, you
for
got it.
Firefly.
Cold hard cash. Firefly, built by Versant. The company launched a couple of years ago. Lilly was one of the investors, MPM D-Chain Capital, $94 million Series A. Versant, as I said, was the founding investor, I believe. And it really hasn't said much about what it's doing, right, Stephen? We don't
Not a lot. I think it's, but it is this sort of interesting concept of essentially you're replacing, for a DAC, or short form for the degrader antibody conjugate, essentially you're replacing the cytotoxic with a degrader. And I think the point is you get greater specificity. So you have the specificity of the antibody and then the specificity of the target of the degrader. And, you can potentially get better effect, especially depending on what that degrader is hitting. So I think we've seen some pretty interesting early data from some of these companies. And so, yeah, no, it looks like a really interesting opportunity.
Yeah, this
for
deal
J&J.
is by far the biggest of the ones we've seen. Nice play by J&J. Hats off to Firefly and its backers. Other big deal out early this week, Insight. What do you know about that one, Stephen?
Yeah, so this is Insight acquiring Vega Therapeutics, which was a subsidiary of this company, Star Therapeutics. Essentially, they've got a phase 3 asset for von Willebrand disease, and that seems to be a good fit, I think, for Insight. Insight, a lot of their focus has been in hematology. A lot of their commercial assets and their pipeline, frankly, is focused on hematology. So it seems to be a really good fit there, and they're paying $1.25 billion upfront for that, and then there's, I think, $750 million in potential milestones there. So I can see that fit, being pretty good for them. I did want to mention also just on the degrader thing, when we were talking about the DACs, there was another degrader deal as well today that we saw, which was Roche paying $700 million upfront for access to a BTK degrader from Nurix, right, Jeff?
Yeah, yep, that's right. It's a pivotal compound for CLL, and I believe there's plans for some other indications, including MS. 2.3 billion biobucks. A couple of other interesting deals today. Everest, a China company that we follow closely here at BioCentury, and a deal with Corcell for China rights to an ophthalmology program. And then GSK in Ingetics. They're going to collaborate on liver fibrosis reversal target discovery, 44 million pounds up front. So quite a few deals are going to make it into our deals report on Monday.
Deals Monday is back, it seems like.
Deals Monday is back. It's good to see for the industry. So hats off to our biotech and pharma BD teams out there. Keep giving us stuff to talk about and think about. All right. Well, Stephen, Steve, Simone, thanks for joining today to talk biopharma on the BioCentury This Week podcast. If you're listening and you like what you hear, subscribe to our podcast. Check out our other podcast, the BioCentury Show, where Stephen, Selena, Simone, Steve, myself, we sit down with a mover and shaker in the industry to get their thoughts. Richard Pops was just on with Steve, and we have some other good shows coming up for you. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks to Kendall Square Orchestra for providing the music for our podcast.